Alrighty, I see a large group of you all joining in. So thank you all so much for joining us today for this webinar for Cities Broadband Funding Webinar, Statewide Open Access Middle Mile Network Implementation. My name is Christina George, and I am the Education and Events Manager at the League of California Cities. In case you miss any information today, this webinar is being recorded, and you can contact a Cal Cities staff member to obtain the recording, and you will find it on our website soon after this webinar. Additionally, throughout today's webinar, attendees, you can all ask questions by writing your question in the question and answer box throughout the webinar. And to write in a question, you have the opportunity to select the question and answer button on your toolbar at the very bottom of your screen. You can also upvote other attendees' questions by clicking the thumbs up button. And in this webinar today, you can also use the raise hand feature to ask a verbal question when that time comes. So we actually have two Cal Cities representatives who will be on our webinar today. And to kick things off, our Cal Cities Legislative Representative, Damon Conklin, will briefly moderate at the very beginning. Damon oversees the Transportation, Communications, and Public Works portfolio, and he will moderate, like I mentioned at the beginning. And then Cal Cities Legislative Policy Analyst, Caroline Sorencioni, will conduct the question and answer at the end. And as you all know, we have a few presenters today that I wanted to further introduce. We have Robert Osborne, the director at the California Public Utilities Commission. We also have Michael Minkus, a policy advisor at the California Public Utilities Commission, and Scott Adams, deputy director for broadband and digital literacy from the California Department of Technology. So we will hear from them soon, but for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Cal Cities Legislative Representative Damon Conklin to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Christina. I really appreciate that warm introduction, and thank you so much again to my colleague Caroline, who's worked together this last year in support of Cal Cities' top strategic priorities for 2021, that being broadband deployment. This has been a very exciting year. As we saw coming out of the pandemic last year, we learned that internet connection is critical to economic opportunity in virtually every aspect of the state. And this has been brought into sharp focus by the pandemic, forcing schools and colleges and offices to really shut down, and millions of students and workers to study and work from home. And what constitutes previously as an inconvenience has now really become nearly impossible for those without a home broadband connection, and made even worse by shutting down of libraries and internet cafes, and those that allowed many without home broadband to get online. Securing funding for critical infrastructure, including broadband, is one of Cal Cities' top strategic priorities for 2021. With a budget surplus announced earlier this year, Cal Cities advocated for increased state, federal resources for critical and sustainable local infrastructural projects, including broadband deployment that enhanced workforce and economic development and improve the quality of life. After intense negotiations earlier this year between the governor's office and their proposed $7 billion and the legislature's countered $1 billion annually, Cal Cities strongly advocated for and successfully secured through the passage and signage of Senate Bill 156, which we're going to be discussing today, a historic broadband legislation to help bridge that digital divide. SB 156 complements Cal Cities' policy priorities of AB 14 and SB 4 that are still pending before the legislature, which would expand cities' abilities to apply for CASF funds and have a stronger voice when negotiating for broadband coverage throughout their communities. SB 156 provides a $6 billion multi-year investment to expand broadband infrastructure and enhance internet access for unserved and underserved communities. More Californians will now be able to access broadband coverage with the construction of a state-owned open access middle mile network and last mile projects that connects underserved households and businesses with local networks. This measure includes three major pieces that we'll be covering today, including the $3.25 billion for a middle mile, an essential first step towards increasing connectivity and affordability for all by making it easier for internet providers to offer faster, cheaper service throughout the state. This is especially important for the nearly 15 million Californians who live in a broadband monopoly, 2 million for the last mile and 700 million to create a new state-funded loan loss reserve to round out those two other major pieces of this bill. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our panel of experts from the California Public Utilities Commission, Robert Osborne, the director, Michael Minkus, policy advisor, and Scott Adams, deputy director for broadband and digital literacy. Robert, are you going first?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Hi, thank you to the League of Cities for this opportunity to speak to you about the governor and the legislature's multi-billion-dollar, multi-year broadband investment. I'm Robert Osborne. I'm director of the Communications Division at the California Public Utilities Commission. Presenting with me today will be Scott Adams from the California Department of Technology, and from the Public Utilities Commission, also Michael Minkus, policy advisor to the Communications Division. We'll talk briefly about the package and then focus on very near-term first request for your input on proposed middle mile locations. Next slide, please. Here we go. Thank you. So this is a problem statement slide that summarizes the broadband needs and gaps that the governor and legislature are looking to address. And we will send these slides out later so you have this. You don't need to write all this down, but these are basically unserved household statistics using the 100 megabits per second threshold that's included in the governor's executive order. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through the $6 billion package that Damon mentioned earlier, and I'll highlight that the goal is to address broadband infrastructure access and affordability. The investments that we'll talk about today are not the whole universe of policies to address broadband infrastructure access and affordability. As Damon said, there's still significant legislation pending, and this package alone won't solve everything. But this is a generational investment, so we'll dive in. So the governor signed budget legislation in July in AB 164, a budget bill, and SB 156, which is the budget trailer bill with 5 key components with planned investments over the next 3 years. So the first is for middle mile, $3.25 billion investment in statewide open access middle mile network. This effort is led by the California Department of Technology, and Scott Adams will share more about this later. $2 billion investment in last mile broadband funding. So when we talk about middle mile and last mile, we'll get into that later about what that means. But last mile is essentially the network that connects your home to the internet. The middle mile is like the spine running up and down the state connecting those last mile components. Third is a $750 million loan loss reserve fund to support local governments and nonprofits in securing outside financing for broadband infrastructure. Think of this as seed funding for financing. Next, $50 million in grants to local governments for technical assistance, and this will be used for cities, counties, communities that are looking to do studies, do assessments of their broadband needs, and help put together broadband plans. And then finally, major changes to the California Advanced Services Fund, otherwise known as CASF, to the grants program, and potential changes in funding to the grant program. Additional changes, including additional funding, are pending right now in the legislature. And as I can imagine, cities are tracking the American Rescue Plan Act. State and local fiscal recovery funds that go toward many of these investments have very tight timelines. The funds must be encumbered before 2025 and spent before 2026. And now I'm going to go through each initiative individually at a high level. Next slide, please. So the $2 billion for last mile funding has a goal of connecting all California's unserved and underserved communities. The ARPA funding in the program means that, as noted earlier, those funds must be encumbered by the 2025 deadline and spent. That it means projects built before 2026 under the federal rules. And so, as I said earlier, this is dedicated to building out the network in communities that would connect to the state-run middle mile. Next slide, please. So the Loan Loss Reserve Fund, as I said earlier, think of this as seed funding for financing. So communities or cities or counties that are looking to raise financing to build broadband for the portions that they do not plan on getting grant funding for. This money it's essentially a revolving loan fund to provide seed capital to raise bonds. Think of it as like a credit enhancement to provide collateral to local governments that want to pursue outside funding. This fund is informed by the ability of public broadband infrastructure, often in partnership with private entities, to create cost-effective and revenue-generating solutions that improve access, lower costs, and improve customer service. So as I said, it's a revolving fund, so the borrowed funding will be returned through the operating funds of a last mile project upon project maturity. And we have a link at the bottom that links to the U.S. Department of Energy, has a summary of energy revenue enhancements that include a loan loss reserve program and a policy tool that may be familiar to some of you. Next slide, please. So local technical assistance, $50 million is dedicated to that. This is for grants to support the formation of public entities and agreements for financing of broadband infrastructure. Activities could include creating joint powers authority and other public organizations to deploy broadband infrastructure for environmental permitting, engineering, and design activities. And this program really builds on the success of something that we put in place last year, the CSF Tribal Technical Assistance Grant. So this is really broadening it to not just tribes, but to other local governments. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a background on how to get involved and track the implementation at the PUC side. The activities fall under two existing proceedings or dockets. And I apologize about the rather arcane nomenclature that we use with our proceeding numbers, but those 20-09001 and the one below that 20-08021 are the numbers used for the two proceedings that we will be using for creating the rules for these various accounts. So the first one, the deployment rulemaking, which is under Commissioner Guzman-Aceves, will handle first middle mile location public comment, and that's in process right now. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later with regard to the due dates. And then secondly, the federal funding account, which we're basically putting together the rules for grants for those accounts. Grants or funding, I should say, financing of those projects. Underneath that is the California Advanced Services Fund, which is an existing proceeding under Commissioner Houck. And that proceeding will consider the technical assistance grant as well as the loan loss reserve program. So to be involved in that, you could either become a formal party to the proceeding or comment informally, and we'll get into that a little later on how to comment. But at the very bottom, we have a link to how to subscribe to the service list. And the service list, basically, when you subscribe, you get all the emails, not all the emails, but all the comments that are posted by parties and any proceeding information that's sent out to the user group. And I think what we're shooting to do is have, well, we have a deadline, and we'll get into that a little later on the middle mile public comment, and we're shooting to have the technical assistance piece come out probably in the next couple of weeks. That's our goal. All right, now I'm going to hand it over to Michael Minkus, who's an advisor to the Commission Communication Division, and he'll speak about the PUC's contribution to the middle mile locations. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to take everyone through this request for comment and opportunity to comment on the middle mile locations, which is a specific part of the larger middle mile project that Scott Adams will speak to later. So switching gears, this slide is a problem statement, sort of answers the what of what is middle mile. So at the opening, Rob Osborne talked about the last mile in the bottom left. Those are the connections sort of from the pole to the house and within communities. The middle mile can be thought of as the tens to hundreds of miles between communities that connects to the wider internet. And this speaks to the problem statement for middle mile, why the state has gone and all of these advocates have gone through such lengths to try to build a statewide middle mile network. It can be the most expensive part of the network. Often when there is infrastructure, it's expensive or is practically not available for capacity or other reasons. And the existing infrastructure is generally proprietary and designed and built and operated to serve one entity. And this gets at the why. So the hope or the goal is that the investment can improve affordability, connect the unconnected, and provide tremendous economic development. So we get into the process where the Public Utilities Commission and other state agencies and partners are soliciting comment. It's outlined in significant detail in the Broadband Trailer Bill, Senate Bill 156, and the individual code sections outlined here. So at a high level, the Public Utilities Commission, in collaboration with a third-party administrator, will assist in the planning of the open access network. This will happen through soliciting public comment, the first bullet, group of bullets, commission staff report on recommended locations for the network, and then ongoing development and implementation, really led by the California Department of Technology. The priorities for this, for analyzing the locations, this smaller portion over which the PUC has a leading role, is to identify existing infrastructure, prioritize routes, identify the end users, and opportunities for leasing, interconnection, and network capacity that could inform the network design. Which gets us to this request for comment. So this is a map, the Anchor Build Fiber Highways map that informed the budget proposal. It was a back of the envelope calculation connecting unserved census designated places, so communities, with portions or routes of the state highway network. So the yellow dots, the bubble map, are the unserved communities. The orange lines connecting them are the identified highway segments. And one practical aspect of the calculation here, or aspect of how this is demonstrated, is that the yellow dots are just located in the center of a community. Their location doesn't necessarily relate to where in a given community there are unserved households. And there are links on this slide which will be available that includes GIS and other information, including the link to this map that can inform comments. So on to the nuts and bolts of the commenting. The proceeding that Rob spoke to is this rulemaking 2009-001. There is a current open request for comment with specific a request for identifying existing infrastructure, priority areas, affordability of the middle mile infrastructure, and information on leasing, interconnection, and network capacity. And these questions are detailed and more in the ruling. The deadline for comment is opening comments. So these are formal comments by entities that make a motion or are already to become a party or already a party. Opening comments are due on or before September 3rd, this Friday, and reply comments are due on or before September 21st. There will be at least an additional ruling to request comment on other aspects outlined in the statute. And this is a link to the ruling request. Later in this deck, we will have detail on how to actually go through the mechanics of becoming a party. So formal party comments are made by an entity. There's a lot of detail here on how to become a party and file comments. The Public Advisor's Office of the Public Utilities Commission can also assist folks. And then even for those who do not become a formal party, who want to augment their formal party comments with other comments, there's this general or informal process that's available publicly to anyone. In terms of timing, the informal comments would be most impactful if they're on the same timeline as the formal party comments. But if someone misses that timeline for whatever reason, we still want to hear. So with that, I will hand it off to Scott Adams, who will take us through more detail on the Middle Mile project.
Hey, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rob. I want to thank the league for having us here to talk to you about, as Damon had said earlier, this, the historic commitment that the state is making to the digital divide. Can you, next slide, Michael? So I'm here to talk about the Middle Mile project that Rob and Michael Minkus had spoken about. Before I do that, I want to kind of pull back the lens and give you all a perspective of who we are, who the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy is, and place it in the context of the work that's going on in the on the digital divide in California. So our office resides inside the Department of Technology. We broadly are one of the entities that manages the statewide interactions in the statewide ecosystem dedicated to closing the digital divide. Because my boss, the state CIO, the California Department of Technology Director, Amy Tong, is the chair of the California Broadband Council. Our office also supports and monitors the work of the Broadband Council, which is a 12-member entity consisting of members of the Senate, the Assembly, and approximately 9 state agencies in the California Emerging Technology Fund. The Public Utilities Commission sits on that, Department of Transportation, General Services. There's a number of folks. The work of the Broadband Council was informed, as Damon had said earlier, with COVID and the pandemic, it added a new responsibility to the Broadband Council through the governor's broadband executive order, which one of the main goals was to have the Broadband Council put together a comprehensive multi-stakeholder, multi-agency broadband for all action plan, which was completed in December 2020. It includes about 24 different action items that are loosely clustered around data and mapping functions, promoting broadband deployment, broadband adoption, digital literacy, and a number of other issues to really rapidly deploy broadband, increase adoption, increase digital literacy, and make sure that everyone in California can thrive in this tech-dependent world that we have. As Michael and Rob have indicated, and Damon did as well, our office's work was additionally shaped by this year's budget and SB 156. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, there you go. Thank you. So Senate Bill 156 was referenced. It was the trailer bill that came out of the broadband funding. Specifically tasked the Department of Technology and the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy to oversee the acquisition and management of the contracts for the development, acquisition, construction, maintenance, and operation of the statewide open access middle mile broadband network. One of the other things that established was that the Deputy Director of Broadband and Digital Literacy would be the main point of contact for the project. Our CDT was tasked with retaining a third-party administrator to work with the partners and lead and manage the implementation of the middle mile network, and then to create a 9-member middle mile advisory committee to monitor the development of the project and provide policy advice as needed. Next slide. One of the first things that the leadership, the working group that other agencies putting this together was to establish guiding principles that acknowledge the the focus of what the state's commitment to broadband was, what the funding was set aside for in the statute, but also to acknowledge the tight timelines that Rob and my colleagues at PUC had mentioned, given the nature of the federal funding to support the project. So the first guiding principle that these shape how our group approaches our work together is to first and foremost provide affordable open access middle mile broadband infrastructure to enable last mile network connectivity throughout the state. The second guiding principle is to build the network expeditiously, leveraging existing infrastructure, networks, and construction projects where feasible. And the third is to prioritize connectivity to unserved and underserved communities, including community institutions. Next slide, please. So that you know, this is a collaborative effort, that is pulling in the contributions from a number of different entities. I want to talk about the leadership that of the Broadband Middle Mile Initiative, which is how we term the whole effort to build out the middle mile network. And the first of those is the Middle Mile Advisory Committee, and that was the statutory requirement to have a committee of entities and members from the legislature to monitor and provide policy advice. That group consists of my boss, Director Tong from the Department of Technology, representative from the Department of Finance, Caltrans, Public Utilities Commission, the GovOps agency, and 2 ex officio members of the Senate and State Assembly, respectively. We have a business partner working group, which is at the staff level. We come together and meet on a weekly basis to report out on our work and to identify barriers and areas where collaboration is needed, and that includes members of the Department of Technology, Department of Finance, Caltrans, the Public Utilities Commission, and will include the third-party administrator when retained. And then lastly, there's a program oversight and state and local fiscal recovery fund reporting group, and that consists of members of the Department of Technology and the Department of Finance. Next slide, please. So the working group, and this is the group that gets together at the staff level and works, is currently comprised of the Department of Technology, Department of Finance, the PUC, and Caltrans. And I'll go through this real quick, but to summarize the responsibilities, Department of Technology is to manage the program and fund and conduct the reporting and oversight of the overall project. Also to acquire and oversee the third-party administrator, and then in collaboration with the third-party administrator and the CPUC, facilitate high-speed broadband access through last mile connectivity. The Department of Finance plays that central oversight and facilitation role, and also is the lead on the state and local fiscal recovery funds quarterly reporting to the federal government. PUC, critical partner throughout the spectrum of the bigger broadband package with the last mile coordination with the middle mile, but as it relates to the middle mile, really providing data to identify the unserved and underserved areas, facilitating the public comment process that Rob and Michael had talked about, and then to recommend network placement and work with us and the TPA on where those segments need to be for the creation of the network. And then lastly, and not in any order of importance, is Caltrans, and their role in the project is to leverage existing transportation projects, and to oversee the management and construction of contracts for open access middle mile broadband network segments that are on the state roadways. Next slide. Real quickly, and I'm sorry this has taken a long time. We've established 8 work streams thus far to help us, expeditiously and get the work moving on the project. And those are the program management and oversight work stream, advisory committee support. The advisory committee meets once per month. Communications, where our agencies are syncing up on communications about the project and with the outside world, managing the external affairs. A lot of stakeholders are interested in the outcome of the project and the impact that the whole package is going to collectively have for their communities like yours. The last 4 work streams are establishing agreements and contracts, data and mapping, which are a critical part of and foundational part of this whole project, then ultimately design and engineering of the segments, and then the build and expand the middle mile. Next slide. Thank you. And it has been a relatively short while since I think it was in mid-July that SB 156 was placed, but a couple of the major accomplishments that we've collectively done is set up and establish the Middle Mile Advisory Committee, had the first advisory committee meeting. We're going to have the second one on September 15th, and established a web page and a home. Having the group working together at the working group level to establish guiding principles, and then working with the leadership and getting those adopted by consent at the Middle Mile Advisory Committee is an accomplishment that we're quite proud of. Making significant progress on our interagency agreements with Caltrans, which we just complete. Almost there with our agreement with the Public Utilities Commission. We're making very good progress in our effort to retain a third-party administrator, and CDT and CPUC and Caltrans have been working very closely over the last several weeks on the data and mapping collaboration. And that is it for me. I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about this, and do want to go back to the topic that my colleagues at the CPUC were here, is that it is critical that we receive input and information through the public comment process, whether it's formal or informal, and get rich and granular data to inform our mapping and as we make progress in building out both the middle mile and then coordinating that with the last mile piece. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you all for such an informative presentation. As mentioned at the beginning, my name is Caroline Cerncioni. I'm an analyst here at Cal Cities. I'm going to be helping to moderate some of our Q&A today. We've got a lot of really great questions coming in, so make sure to keep sending those, and I'll make sure to raise them for our panel here. The first question I have is there an approximate timeline for the $50 million for local agency technical assistance, and will it be available through a competitive grant application process?
I can answer that. So we're in the process. We haven't published the staff proposal yet on the grant program, so that's still in the works. So I can't really say anything about that until it's come out, but the idea is it should follow very similarly to what we have with the tribal technical assistance. So if that's already up and going, so if you want to, we can send you a link to that program so you can understand how that works.
Great. Okay, awesome. Moving on. This might be a good one for Scott. I know there were a couple questions about this in the chat. We know that SB 156 establishes a broadband advisory committee, which you covered in your presentation. What can we do to ensure that, our local governments and some of the communities that this is intended to serve will be able to have some voice or be able to have some input with regards to that advisory committee?
Oh, thank you. That's such a great question. So first, the committee and its membership was established by statute. And so too were the regularity of the meetings, which are on a monthly basis. Those are public and open meetings. There is a public comment process. So we would encourage, that any, local representatives or constituents, provide public comment either during the meeting or on the committee website that has an electronic public comment form. I would also just, again, go back to, one of the main topics discussed at the beginning, and that's the PUC process, is that now is a critical time for local voices to be heard and to, submit information into the public comment process on the locations and other pieces of information that are needed to do that. And so I think those are two really great avenues.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Seems like some good opportunities there for us. Another question we've got in the chat is, how do we see some of our internet service providers like AT&T and Comcast and others using this middle mile network? Is there any kind of idea that they would also be kind of building off of that backbone? What are your thoughts on their role?
I'll go first, but I also would, I'm sure that Rob or Michael would have something to say. I think that when you look at, the state's efforts, the issues identified in the Broadband for All Action Plan, that the cost constraints and the gaps in middle mile infrastructure and funding to get broadband further out there. This funding and the middle mile project piece really is it's an opportunity to do a great public value for the state, which is to offset some of those costs that have historically been barriers to enable a host of last mile entities, whether it's existing ISPs, new entrants, local cities and counties, or other eligible entities to do last mile. It's really, open to partnership from those who want to, step in and help us achieve the goal of constant connectivity for, on an underserved Californians. And so, Rob, Michael?
Yeah, I would say the short answer is yes, it's open to any last mile providers. I think the reason we have this really coming forward as an important initiative is we're trying to address the communities where there is no middle mile. AT&T in a lot of cases has middle mile in place already. The challenge is communities where AT&T is not investing, so we'd need another last mile provider, or AT&T, it doesn't really matter, but that's the point of the middle mile, to really enable providers to build out that last mile and not have to worry about also building a middle mile.
And to amplify that point, some middle mile networks in other states have been really critical to making more universal wireless coverage, and especially rural wireless coverage.
Great. Thank you all for pitching in on that one. I see Michael Mulaney's helping us out in the chat. Thank you so much for that. I'm seeing some questions about the definition of unserved. I know that we've heard some argue that maybe there's some confusion around the definition of unserved for middle mile projects versus the definition of unserved for some of those last mile projects through CASIF. So is there any clarity you can provide there about those definitions that might help answer some of those questions and that confusion that we've been hearing?
Sure, I'll start off and Michael can elaborate. So under federal guidelines, the definition of served has a speed threshold of 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits per second up, but there's a qualification that it be reliable. So that's essentially the guideline for the funding for the last mile federal funding projects.
Okay, great. Moving on to the next question. And we might need some clarity around this one unless our experts know what this is. The question from Brian says, is the state open to leasing space in municipally owned Meet Me rooms as it identifies routes and constructs for its middle mile network? Or does that conflict with the idea of the state-owned middle mile? If we need more clarity, we can open up the lines, but any thoughts on that question?
This is Michael Minkus, and I can take a stab. I think the high level is these are the sorts of things that we would like to receive in comments. So whether it's specific to Meet Me rooms or some other local or publicly owned or even privately owned, but might not be as readily known about asset, that's the kind of thing that could be helpful to file in comments informally or formally.
Great. And if there's any more follow-up to that, feel free to raise your hand. We can answer that question live as well. Another question here says, how much need will be served by this $6 billion? It seems like the network is pretty expensive. I know that there's other funding opportunities available at the federal level coming in, but do you have any way to kind of assess how far this might take us and kind of where this might put us in closing the digital divide? I know we don't have a crystal ball, but we know it's a big step forward.
Yeah, so we, the California Broadband Council published an action plan last year, and included in that was a cost model estimate to build out broadband to all the unserved locations. That was really the starting point for what we put together later with this middle mile network estimate. I think the quick answer is it's not going to solve everything, but it will make a significant dent. I think it will cost more than what we have. And as you mentioned, there is additional federal funding that might come online as well. And we definitely want to take advantage of that.
Okay, great. Another question that I have, and a lot of questions that I've been getting, and I know a lot of this is still kind of being decided, and so that's okay if that's the answer. But a lot of our cities have been asking, you know, how they can be competitive and what they can do in the meantime to best situate themselves and their projects for success and opportunities for funding. So do you have any recommendations about, you know, what cities can be doing now to get the ball rolling and to be competitive, you know, when it is time for some of these funding pots like the loan loss reserve account to kind of open up and be ready to rock and roll?
I can start and Michael or Scott can jump in, or Michael Mulaney. I think what we see over time is half the challenge is organizing people and organizing agencies and resources around a common goal. I think once that's achieved, it's a matter of then putting together a plan and then working with the partners. It could be incumbent carriers, it could be new carriers, it could be new deployment models. And that's something we're seeing in other states, as Michael Minkus mentioned, where incumbents have decided not to really invest anymore. And so municipalities are trying different models with wholesale fiber, fiber that goes to the home that has multiple service providers, so that there's actually service competition rather than facilities-based competition or lack of competition, as the case may be. So I think half the battle is the organization and getting people together around a common goal, and then bringing the right partners in.
Okay, great. We have a good question here that is asking us to kind of elaborate on some of the last mile funding. It says, how does the state envision last mile building getting accomplished with the $2 billion? What is the prioritization and the qualifications for those last mile projects? Will the state own the last mile? And will the last mile mirror some of the ARPA last mile requirements? I know that's a loaded question and we can answer it in pieces, but it seems like just a little more elaboration on the last mile specifically would help answer this question.
Sure. So the last mile rules have not yet been proposed, and that's under one of the proceedings that we talked about, the broadband proceeding under Commissioner Guzman-Aceves. Once that staff proposal is out for comment, then it'll be clear what the idea is about how that program would work. But the short answer on the state is not planning to own the last mile. The grant or the money would be provided to a last mile construction project, and then the owner would be whoever is financing that. And that could be a JPA, it could be a municipality, it could be an incumbent. So any of those options are available.
Okay, great. As we're going through these questions too, I want to remind everyone, feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a verbal question. Our next question is, could this funding be used to create a municipally owned utility to provide open access to a community?
Absolutely, yes.
That's great. That's great news. I know Michael Mullaney is helping to answer this question behind the scenes, but there's a question in here that says, are there assistance programs for lower income residents in communities that have reliable access, but it's unaffordable or out of reach?
Yeah, so this is really, I'd say, the cutting edge of what we have currently in place, a program called Lifeline. There's a federal subsidy and a state subsidy. The focus of Lifeline has traditionally been on telephone service, but the FCC recently, because of the COVID situation, started a program called the Emergency Broadband Benefit, the EBB. And that's really the first serious foray into subsidizing broadband service for low-income customers. That has been in place since, I think, late April. California has, I think, the largest number of participants in that program. I think there's over 80 companies offering EBB plans in California. I expect that will probably continue in some fashion, maybe not in how it exists today. One of the drawbacks is that there's no cap in terms of the price. The subsidy is up to $50 per month per subscriber, but the provider could offer a plan that's $100, in which case the customer would still need to pay $50. So there's still more room for improvement on that program, but that to me is like the most obvious program that would be a potential successor in the future for subsidizing low-income access.
Maybe to add to that a little on the policy level, there are a number of bills still pending in the California legislature that would hopefully get at this issue, including an extension of the California Advanced Services Fund program, which includes adoption, public housing support that could be really helpful at getting at subparts of the connectivity issue.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you raised that too. For people on the call that don't know, Cal Cities is supporting those bills that he mentioned, the AB 14 and SB 4. Those are some of our priority bills right now. So we are in support of those. And if you want to be engaged on those, we do have city sample letters on our website. Another question I have here is, can that local agency technical assistance funding be used to create a city's fiber optic master plan? I know a lot of our cities are doing broadband planning right now, and so I guess that question would also cover some other kinds of planning that maybe some of our cities might be interested in doing if they haven't started those processes already.
I think the intention is to cover that. I don't know if it would fully pay for a plan. It depends on the size of the plan, but more of that will come out when we publish the staff report in that proceeding, and that would probably be the best way to know. I don't want to jump ahead of the proceeding.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. The next question is just asking for some clarity. The question says the 3.5 billion the state will invest to build the middle mile network with no grants for local municipalities in that pot, but the 2.5 billion for the last mile could be granted to other entities. Is that correct?
Correct. So yeah, the last mile funding is available to local entities or incumbents.
Okay, great. I have a question here. It says, has there been any discussion around minimum service levels for the end user? One of note, minimum service speeds like 100 megabytes per second download referenced earlier, or minimum commitments to provide redundant service or repair response times to reduce loss of service. We know that some of our communities have struggled losing service, and we've worked on a couple of bills that had to do with backup power for telecoms. So I think this question is really getting at how can we ensure that we don't lose service, and then also are there any kinds of minimum service levels that we're hoping our end users will be able to have?
So there are specific requirements in the federal legislation for the performance in terms of speed. I'm not sure if latency is addressed. Maybe Michael, you know. And then I think with regard to redundancy, that would be more in the realm of the local broadband plan. It would have to be designed to be redundant so that you don't have just a single point of failure. Michael, I'm not sure if you have more on the funding aspect.
Yeah, I think it comes into play in that it can be addressed. There's sort of an opportunity to bring other data to bear on whether or not an area should be eligible and on requirements that a funding recipient needs to meet. So one of the places that will play out is in the implementation of the last mile or federal funding account.
Okay. Great. We've talked a little bit about how you guys are soliciting feedback for certain areas, but this question here says, what kinds of local agencies are you targeting? Are you kind of looking at rural areas, underserved areas, or small local agencies? You know, how are you going to make those targeting and prioritization determinations?
So there is, in the legislation, there's sort of funding specifications as to how much money goes to which county and that sort of thing. But basically what we're focused on is unserved households and community anchor institutions, and that's the starting point. So from there, then we go out to, we'll, you know, consider funding, you know, as I said earlier, it could be a municipal broadband, it could be a JPA, it could be an incumbent, it could be a wholesaler, so any of those models.
Okay, and that might help answer one more question I have in here that says, do these funds apply to city municipal site connectivity? It sounds like possibly based on your previous answer.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, at this time, we do not have any more questions in the queue. So thank you so much for taking the time to go through all of those. I see Damon popped up. Damon, do you have any comments before we close it out here today?
Yeah, no, first and foremost, I want to thank Christina George and her team for putting on a wonderful webinar. Also, Caroline, fabulous job moderating those questions. But before we wrap up, I want to thank our panelists for their generous time spending educating our members and industry partners on this very, very important issue. I'd like to just briefly kick it back to the panelists if they'd be willing to just offer any final thoughts or final suggestions for those that are on the webinar that you'd like to at least impart to.
I'll go first. Could you, so you said, what is some advice? I would say that this is such a unique opportunity in time. brought about by unfortunate circumstances, but where we have federal and state policy leadership and funding aligned to really go that pardon the pun, the last mile to help close this persistent digital divide that we've had in the state that was exacerbated and by COVID. So please to the extent that this is a priority, make it more of a priority and communicate with the PUC for this initial step, and then continue to communicate with us throughout the process on where communities are in their level of readiness, where they potentially need assistance, where we can leverage our efforts or those of the broadband councils to support them. And we look forward to getting it done, and we hope that we know that you'll join us.
Thank you very much. Michael or Robert, any final thoughts?
Just wanted to say that, for the past 10 years that I've been at the commission, we've pursued a certain strategy where we rely on incumbents to put forward projects. And I think that sort of has played itself out. And now, the pandemic, as Scott has said, really highlighted the problem that still remains. And I think this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to try a different approach. And it really is a generational investment. I don't know any other state that's taking this as seriously as California. And we're going to need everyone's help to do this. We'll need all the cities involved. We need to work with them collaboratively, with incumbents, with new providers, to just solve it. And so I'm really excited about this opportunity.
To follow up briefly, just want to amplify those points. Let's not think small. This is the chance to think about ways to kind of definitively and thoroughly address the problem, now and into the future. And then on the more specific, we want to hear from you on the micro. So in terms of this pending ruling in middle mile locations, and the macro in how all of this, these programs and this funding is implemented, and what the needs are of the communities you represent.
Great. Michael Mullaney, I want to make sure we provide an opportunity for you if you had a final thought to include as well.
I would be happy to. So I'm sorry, and I don't think I actually introduced myself. I'm Michael Mullaney, I'm advisor for CQC President Maryfield Matcher. I've been hastily typing responses to all the great questions in the chat, and always feels free to reach out to any of us. We're always very happy to engage with you on broadband issues. But I think the advice I always give to local government officials is, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So if you really raise hell and you advocate for your constituents and you say, I don't want DSL anymore. I want the latest, greatest fiber technology. And you make sure you have folks out here, joining these workshops, talking to commission staff, talking to providers. That's the way to get these grants approved. And so I just think, don't hesitate to call folks and call them again, send letters. Really engage, because that's really how we're going to get this done.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for contributing. And just a quick reminder to our members that lobbying and providing a voice for you in Sacramento, it's so important. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and each one of you have provided these wonderful questions that helps us craft our frequently asked questions and our communications circulating back to our members on SB 156. We appreciate the input. As we go through and wrapping up the last 2 weeks of session, we've got a couple other pending policies that are critical for to harmoniously integrate and blend in with SB 156, ensuring full deployment of broadband to all the communities throughout the state. And without your input, without unleashing your energy, we're not able to effectively educate and motivate and lobby on your behalf. So we want to thank each and every one of our members for their continued leadership and support in our advocacy efforts. With that, that's the end of our webinar. I believe our contact information has been posted on the slides, and that we will have this webinar available to our members to access it at a later time and can get those contact information for any follow-up questions they may have that they would like for us to pass along and get them responded and pass along back to them. With that, that is the conclusion of our webinar. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. And again, thank you to our speakers.